Welcome back. So this module, we're going to be talking about unions and collective bargaining. This is going to be in chapter 12. So far, we've talked about how wages are determined by the interaction of supply and demand within the labor market. But there are going to be some other labor market institutions that can also influence wages. We're going to talk about them throughout the rest of this class. So later on, we'll talk about minimum wages and occupational licensing. But for now, we're going to focus on labor unions. There are many facets of labor unions to study. In this chapter, we're going to look at it from, you guessed it, an economic perspective. So we're going to focus on some of the effects of unions on supply and demand. We're going to see how they interact with management and they negotiate employees' contracts. Now, today, around 11% of workers are considered members of a labor union. This has fallen from a peak in the 1950s of around 28% of workers. However, despite the fact that they become much less prominent, there's fewer workers that are unionized. Unions are still an important labor market institution that is worth considering in this course. So union membership is concentrated in certain sectors of the economy. So even though we're only looking at around 11% today, in some sectors, it's everyone or pretty much everyone. So they can be very important depending on what exactly industry you're in. So as manufacturing employment has fallen, the share of workers in unions have fallen because unions tend to be heavily in manufacturing in those roles. Despite the fact that it has fallen, like I said, they're still dominant in some of those industries, especially in the manufacturing industry. So even though there's fewer employees total, unions are still going to be very dominant, very important things to deal with in those industries. Likewise, unions can have broader effects, not just on unionized employees. So firms that employ non-union workers may give them similar wages to workers that are employed in a union shop or members of unions. So these firms kind of, follow the lead of the contracts that the unions negotiate, kind of sets the standard for the industry, or at least it'll force them to move in that direction. So union membership growth didn't really begin until the 1930s. Now, seeing the timeline, we'd be tempted to say it's because of the Great Depression. It was a response to, the massive unemployment that we saw as a result of the Great Depression. But there is a problem with that. Your textbook goes through some of the history, but I'll touch on it briefly here. Typically in recessions, union membership tends to fall instead of increase. That's because in recessions, there's going to be fewer jobs around. So there's going to be less people that are able, that can be employed in the union. It was actually in good times that we saw, when there was economic expansion, that union membership would historically increase. And this goes back quite a long time back, to the beginning of labor unions. We could say that the Depression did indirectly cause growth in union membership because it led to legislation that did support unionization. And it was this change in legal standards and how the government's laws and regulations dealt with unions that allowed them to grow. So the legislation began with the Norris-LaGuardia Act of 1932. This limited the use of court injunctions against unions by employers. So it stopped them from using the courts to stop unionization. This was huge to allow unions to actually to grow. The act also outlawed contracts that firms would have employees sign stating that they would never join a union. So they, again, couldn't use this other thing to try to prohibit or prevent unions from starting. And at the time, these were two of the best tactics that firms would use to stop the formation of unions. Next came the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. This had several important provisions that gave workers the right to elect their own representatives for unions. It forced employers to recognize and bargain with these union representatives, and it prohibited discriminating against employees because of their union activity or for trying to set up a union. It also created the National Labor Relations Board. Unsurprisingly, union membership took off after these laws were passed. Now it was much easier for unions to be organized at these firms, and it'll encourage more people to join unions because it's now easier. The firms didn't have these easy paths to block the formation of unions. After this took place, there was some important legislation later that sought to somewhat limit union power. So the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 limited some unfair practices that unions would engage in. This was after the end of World War II, when all the GIs came back. They went into labor force. There was some issues with the economy, some difficulties it went through. Um, union strikes, helped exacerbate these problems. So the Taft-Hartley Act limited them, and it allowed states to choose to be right to work. Basically, in right to work states, if there's like a union and when an industry at a firm, you don't have to be a member of a union to be able to work. In other states, they can prevent you from doing that. And the next one is the Landrum-Griffin Act of 1959. This was passed in response to some union corruption that was going on at the time. So now, why has the unionization rate fallen from its peak? There's several reasons that economists cite. So the first is going to be the fraction of labor force of women have increased. Women have historically been less likely to join a labor union than men, but over time, this difference has diminished. So now it's not quite as stark as it was back in, say, like the 1960s or 70s. Many industries that are heavily unionized have seen substantial decreases in employment, like I mentioned earlier. So not just manufacturing, but mining and construction, these industries are also often also heavily unionized. As we've seen employment go down because of increase in productivity and the use of more capital equipment over hiring more employees, we've seen the number fall, even though for like manufacturing in the United States, manufacturing production is actually up. We just have far fewer workers producing, even more than we did before. Additionally, since World War II, we've seen a regional shift southward towards the Sun Belt, so going from the east all the way through the West Coast. Unionization in these states, especially in the American South, are lower than in the Midwest and the Northeast. The populations where the population came from and where a lot of these firms came from. Now, some argue that the cause of the decline came from more hostility towards the unions from management. That management may be limited by law with what they can do to prevent unionization, but they still have some ability to respond and some ability to try to discourage their workers from joining unions and organizing, getting them started. This could come from trying to maximize profits. That's one of the major points of a firm is to profit, try to maximize their profits so they can maximize their shareholder value. But some of it might be from a genuine desire to stay in business. So because we've seen an increase in global competition, especially from places with much lower cost of production than the United States, which includes, the employees' wages, businesses can't afford to allow labor costs to increase above certain levels. They don't have the kind of room that they used to have, say, back in like the 50s and 60s when the world was a lot less connected and, Europe was still recovering from World War II. So one response that firms have tried to adopt is what's called high-performance work systems, and they seek to maximize productivity and to help workers deal with problems in production. So it kind of helps the employees in a lighter way than union would, not quite as strongly as a union, to help deal with problems in whether it's like in the production process or just general problems in the workplace, but also helps management because it seeks to increase worker productivity at the same time. I'd encourage you to read more about this, excuse me. Your textbook contains a little bit more talking about this. Now, it's important to note that had there not been growth in public sector unions, the decline in union membership would have been much more severe. For the longest time, through the 20th century for a while, public sector unions were not legal, so they couldn't be formed. Once they began to allow this in the 20th century, they steadily began to grow. And a large portion of union workers today are from public sector unions. So they work for either local government, the state government, or the federal government. Now, other factors besides legislation have been a driver of union growth. It's not just the legislation. Legislation allowed the growth in unions to occur, but then there's other things going on that encouraged some of the growth that we saw, through the 50s. The plateaued for a while, and then we saw the slow and steady decrease over time. So now we can talk about a few of those. So even though early on that the changes in the law back during the Great Depression made unions easier to form at firms, workers still need to want to join labor unions. If they don't want to join labor union, they're not going to spend the time to organize to create it. And also we see that the later reforms in the post-World War II reforms weren't enough to cause the decline in unionization that we've seen since the 50s, that they may have limited some of the union tactics, but not enough to prevent people from joining and to encourage them to actually leave unions. So there are a number of reasons that we've seen unionization grow and then begin at earlier and then now begin to fall for the past 40, 50 years. So some of the important things are the types of industries that we have in the country, where we focus more on manufacturing or service or now like information technology. The psychology of workers, their mental space, what they consider useful, what they consider necessary, what they're willing to put up with at work from management. There's some institutional factors. There's some credit important labor leaders. There's a lot more. But economists, obviously, they're going to turn to supply and demand. I can hear you guys groaning through the computer already. So we can model the demand for unions where imagine the quantity demanded for unions is inverse to the price of services. So we can think of the price as like the union dues or other fees, maybe extra time spent on union activity. So we have this, downward sloping demand curve that we normally see in markets. Now we'd expect that the supply of the union would increase as the dues increase. It's easier to organize a union when workers are willing to pay more. You can even organize smaller groups of workers. You can go into more narrow industries or the individual firms that are like smaller in size. If I guess the employees are willing or union members are willing to pay more, so you can hire more union representatives to actually go and to do the organizing to help run it outside of that. So the changes we've talked about so far over time, the growth and then the slow decline of unions, fit pretty well in this model, and we can use it to explain a lot of the changes that we've seen. So the legal protections that we first saw from the Norris LaGuardia Act and the Wagner Act, this lowered the cost of unionizing. It made it much cheaper, much easier, much simpler to actually be able to form a union rather than, think back to the 1800s, actually getting into brawls with management and having to go through the court system and getting struck down, spending a lot of money fighting through those court cases. Now it was much easier after these acts were passed to actually get the union formed. So this would shift the supply of unions to the right, or increase the supply of unions. Now we tend to see union membership decline during recessions. Here we can also use our model of supply and demand to try to understand this. So employers would have greater resistance to unions during economic downturns, which would again increase the cost of unionizing, or imagine shift the supply curve to the left. Even the decline in recent years makes sense within this model. Now, the four potential causes we talked about earlier would all shift the demand curve to the left, decrease demand, and this is basically what we've seen. As much as economists would like to believe it, supply and demand can't explain everything in the world. There's an economist, Ashenfelter, he used an econometric model to try to estimate the changes in union membership over time. And he included several variables, things just beyond the very simple supply and demand, but things that can influence them. So he included things like the inflation rate. Wages tend to increase more slowly than the price of goods. So support for unionization should rise during inflationary periods. There's just an article I read today or yesterday on CNN.com about this that's going on right now. Additionally, the change in employment in sectors that tend to have union presence is another important thing. So when labor is in short supply, management has the most difficulty opposing unions. In that case, it's much easier. Sometimes they're forced to give in to the union demands because they just don't have many other options. Now, you need some way to measure or try to approximate the level of worker discontent, because this is very important. Workers that are discontent, that are upset with how management is running the business, how much they're paying them, what have you, are more likely to join a union than workers that are happy with what's going on. Another important component of or determinant of the growth in unionization is the proportion of industry that's already unionized. And for no other reason that the more heavily unionized the workforce is, the less room there is for it to grow. And the last thing is the legislature's union sentiment, is the legislature, whether it's Congress or state governments, are they pro-union? Are they against union? Do they want to make it easier for unions to be formed, or do they want to make it more difficult for unions to be formed? So how do you deal with these variables? In his model, looking back over decades in the United States, they accounted for about 75% of the change in unionization rate, which is pretty good for a model like this. So that's some strong evidence that these five things, these five variables, definitely have some influence, combined most of the influence on the unionization rate, on the growth in unions. The one thing I want to note, especially, is that the change in the price level was a strong factor related to union growth. It was the strongest of the five, or at least he found was the strongest of the five. Now, this should make sense to us, especially with what we're seeing today. As prices continue to increase at or above 8%, where we've been for a while, even with wage increases, workers tend to be worse off than they were a year or 2 years ago. I think, if I'm recalling correctly, real wage growth has been about -2% over the past year across all workers. Since inflation was low since the recession in 2007, I mean, like between 0 and 2%, wage growth has also been very low. It wasn't really necessary for high wage growth to keep up with inflation because inflation was so low. But now that prices are rapidly rising, wages have not been able to keep up. Now, some of this is natural. It's not firm's fault that this is the case. Some of it is because many places negotiate wages or they give raises once per year. So they just haven't had time to catch up yet. There's also a psychological factor where people are primed, to borrow the term from psychology. So they're used to giving, say, a 2% raise. That's what they've been doing for years. So giving an 8% raise to keep up with inflation seems like a huge deal, even though it isn't. That they're used to these much smaller numbers, so they're going to be much less likely to give a higher raise. In a situation like this, unions can force negotiations in the meantime. So rather than waiting every year, but after 6 months, the wages, inflation was running quite high, they can force new negotiations and to get raises to at least keep up with inflation. Basically trying to negotiate to get management to give a fair wage increase because of how high inflation is. And this is especially important when the level of inflation we're seeing isn't the level that management is used to. If America, United States consistently had 5% inflation for the past 15, 20 years, it would be kind of baked in. Management would be used to it, to be giving these 5% raises. But when it jumps from 2% to 8, 9% within like a year, it's going to be much more difficult for management to take that into account. And you're going to have sorts of struggles that make employees more willing to unionize because they have, their wages aren't keeping up with inflation. What unions can also push wages far past, what's reasonable. They can try to force like really high wages above what the market would dictate. Obviously, that's possible. They're just trying to negotiate higher wages. But really, that's not a concern right now in this high inflationary environment. You end up with just trying to get it to reach where it was before, trying to keep up with inflation. But in addition to wages, the relationship between management and workers is also important. This might sound like common sense, but obviously, if workers feel like they can just talk to management and they'll hear them out, they're allowed to express their ideas or concerns that are going on and be respected for them, and being implemented where appropriate. If they feel they're being respected and treated well by management, the desire for unionization goes down. It's when they feel, workers feel that they're not being listened to, that there's something seriously wrong, that there's no other way to change, that they turn to unionization.